Oh, yeah.
2 minutes after
Yeah.
6.
No, actually,
So I'm
yeah,
going to
that's-
call the February meeting of the Ann Arbor Energy Commission to order. Would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Eaton.
Here.
Commissioner Palig.
Here.
Commissioner Lenski.
Here.
Commissioner Mursky.
Present.
Vice Chair Clevey.
Here.
Chairman Appleyard.
Here?
Commissioner Colvin Garcia. Commissioner McCumber.
I'll call for an approval of the agenda as amended, as what you have on your desk is a little different than what was sent out a little earlier today.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes. Approval of the minutes.
Commissioner Mursky sent out a couple quick corrections, so they're shown in blue in the copy that you've got there, if you care to take a look on the second page, or if you want to comment on it, or pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it basically just, I think, corresponded with my verbal comments.
Great.
So,
Okay. There's one other correction here that I'd like to make. In the approval of the minutes, it says that they were approving the agenda. So we just
that around.
need to change that word from agenda to minutes.
Cool.
Under that paragraph.
There, yes.
Any other corrections or alterations? Not? I'll call for a motion to approve.
So moved?
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Moving on. First, we have the ability for the public to come up to the microphone and state their name and talk about something about energy that they would really like to talk about. So if there's anyone in the audience that would like to come up, please do so now. There's also a spot at the end of the meeting in case you're bashful. No one's moving. Okay, I will close the public input. Move on to the energy report.
All right, so I wanted to first plug the next Sustainability Forum in partnership with the Downtown District Library. It's coming up on March 8th. It will have a focus on civic life in Ann Arbor, and we'll have the event moderated by Civ City founder Mary Morgan, as well as representatives from the Ann Arbor Community Foundation, Avalon Housing, WEMU, and most likely some staff from the library itself, so a diverse group touching on elements of sustainability, but in particular, the engagement aspects in civic life here in Ann Arbor. So a bit of a different twist, and hope you can make that on the 8th. And we had a great event last week that Commissioner Mursky helped to MC. If you want to, not sure if you want to share anything more on that.
So we had 3 speakers, myself. We had also Matt Naud, who had to step in for Emily, who got sick. And then we had Andy Berkey from the University of Michigan providing perspectives from the city and from the University of Michigan. Unfortunately, we had also planned on having an industrial perspective presented by NSF that actually would have been very interesting. They work on a lot of standards that are used by manufacturers for comparability of sustainability features of various products. But unfortunately, we had 2 people who had to step out because of issues that they had. So maybe we can get them, Nate, and pass it on to Emily next year, because I think the perspective would be interesting.
Yeah.
But it was a good turnout, including a couple people that are here tonight.
Yeah. It's a good show. Some interesting stuff. It's always good to work on metrics.
Yeah. Wanted to mention next frontier for electric vehicle charging, hopefully here in Ann Arbor. We're looking at on-street opportunities, and in particular with the approaching Fifth Avenue construction project, trying to coordinate with DTE as they regain momentum in this space. They've had an interest in helping further this issue, and so we've got some support at the DDA to likely install chargers near City Hall on Fifth Avenue. So more to come, but excited to kick that off, kind of in alignment and furtherance of our solar carport EV work that's been underway as well. So as we do this kind of thing in the streets, we want to see if there's a way to think about and at least plan for, and in some instances install EV charging on streets. So I wanted to mention that.
Great.
That's it for now.
Excellent. Other info that people would like to pass on? Energy information? Okay. Moving right along, we're honored tonight to have a presentation on solar and school system by the A2 STEAM School. So,
I'm Jeannie Wilson. I'm a teacher at A2 STEAM. I teach 6th grade science and social studies and an environmental studies course. And I have this wonderful club that meets after school, and they're going to tell you a little bit
if you'd
about their
speak into the
project.
microphone, then
Sorry,
people
I
at
was
home
like
could see.
talking the wrong way. They're going to talk to you about their project. I'm sorry. I'm
you.
like used to facing kids. Sorry.
That's okay.
Don't turn your back on.
Thank you. So I want to help get them started, but they're my students. Some of them were my students last year in science. Some are my students this year in science. And they're going to tell you all about their project. But enough of me. Let's get them up. Let me put this up. Okay.
Great.
Who's first? You first? Go
I
ahead.
don't know if we can do anything with the microphone. It might be a little high.
So,
Oh,
I'm
no, I
South
can
Field. So our Solar at STEAM project, our goal is to get solar panels on our roof. So our mission is we will make our school more eco-friendly and have sustainable energy and not emit as much carbon dioxide. We want to have 100 panels on our roof by the end of summer 2018.
Wow, excellent.
Wow.
So, it started out during 6th grade for me, or last year, when a group of students were learning about carbon output and electrical use in our school and around the world. And we were wondering what we could do about it. So what we did, there's a class, I guess, that is kind of mandatory to take in our school. It's like a leadership class, and a few kids, including myself, had an idea to put solar panels on our school for the leadership class. And what we did a lot of research, we did a lot of planning, and we talked with Miss Wilson about, some ways that maybe we could put solar panels on our school. And Miss Wilson got a Sunventrix quote that ended up almost matching basically what our plan was. And so that's basically how it kicked off. So, yeah.
Next slide, so you can see this. Vic, you guys know your slides.
So one of our questions was how are solar panels useful? So one thing is they would reduce our carbon emissions and fossil fuels, and therefore we'd be less dependent on them because we have like a limited supply of them. And then with this long-term savings that goes into using solar panels, that would allow us to have more money for field trips and things like that, and school supplies and more activities, which would increase our learning. And then any time that STEAM generates more power than they need, it could go back into the grid and DTE would pay us.
Okay. So the numbers show that we could reduce the amount. We could produce about 10% of our energy that we use now with solar panels, and we collected data, and the estimated system's output would be 33,333 kilowatt hours per year, and we want to increase the percentage 10% of our production by using the data we collected to help us more reduce our consumption, to help more decrease our carbon emissions.
Okay, we calculated our estimated savings, and our school pays about $3,751 per month in energy bills. 10% of that is $375 $5.10 per month in reduced bills on average. This means that over a year would save about $4,501.20. This does not take into account any money we would get for times when overflow goes to the grid and DTE pays us. This is why this pilot is so valuable for the district. How long will it take for the array to pay for itself? What are the costs and benefits to solar school?
We would have a large amount of electricity being generated by our array. If we add 100 solar panels, we can reduce an estimated amount 18.4 metric tons of carbon dioxide each year. That is equivalent to 471 tree saplings planted each year.
So here on these two graphs, you can see in the first one that the first graph shows the rise of temperature because of climate change, and you can see it spiked a lot. And then also the second one shows the carbon in our atmosphere from fossil fuels, and that is just from the past few years. And how this will impact other schools, if we get solar panels on our school, if this works out well and it actually helps us a lot and we save a lot of money from it, other schools in the Ann Arbor district might like go to solar panels too, and it would actually like mitigate a lot of climate change and like carbon in our atmosphere.
The educational advantages of going solar. Would be many educational benefits of solar panels because we could track our energy production and consumption, and we could also understand how energy flows and how we use electricity. We can also see how our energy production will mitigate carbon by not using fossil fuels, and we can learn to make small changes for big impact to mitigate climate changes and adapt to the new realities it will bring. And the other thing it will that will help education is that we could track the temperatures in the rooms, mostly upstairs, before and after the solar panel installation, because it would, the solar panels would absorb some of the heat and it might cool down or it might heat up. So, that would be educational.
So, now that we've gone on through basically the good effects, we need to have some ideas or how we're actually going to be able to do this. So our main plan is one, to raise money using corporate sponsorships, some events maybe, and companies that might want to donate. Next, we would, work with the school district, the city of Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan, and DTE, and maybe try and get a quote to work out and have our array professionally installed. Third, we could monitor our production and see, we could see, basically, if the cloud, we could track clouds and we could track how much energy we're producing and see the differences. And then we're also receiving some mentoring from my people in my school, Solar Schools Foundation, I think. So, yeah, that's basically our plan. And that's
Click on our website.
okay. Okay. Okay, this is gonna be.
It's very. It's important. Blinking.
I see snow.
Oh, there it
there
is.
we
So,
All right.
this is our website that we've made, and so, yeah, just.
Those are some of our donors.
And this is a bit of information about us over here. And then these are our grants, and then we also have a Facebook page, but we don't need to go to that right now.
Really no.
And then this is more just about us as a solar art STEAM project. And then this is where you can donate.
That's great.
They did all of
Why
this
should you?
themselves. They're fabulous.
And then here's about like a bit more about us. And then we have like what you get depending on how much money you donate. And then here are like the donated and go down. And then what is solar power? Where all the things go.
Very good.
Do you want to ask them
Can't.
any questions?
Or more again. And the tail tracker. And then go down. This is so hard to use.
Ask them if they have any questions.
Okay. Do you have any questions?
Thank you for coming.
Outstanding.
Questions from the
Outstanding
commission?
project.
Oh no,
Yeah.
the X button.
I just have one comment on the project that you're looking at. You said you're looking to get an installer, a solar installer to professionally install the system. I'm not sure what the laws are with the school system, but it might be worth looking at to see how much of the project could be done with volunteer labor. Wayne worked on a project in Ypsilanti that put solar systems on a firehouse, done mostly with volunteers. And you can reduce your installed cost dramatically. There's many things that can be done besides hooking the electricity up on the roof that have to be done with an electrician. But these panels come in a truck. They got to be taken off the truck. They got to be taken out of the boxes. They got to be stacked. All the nuts, bolts, and screws need to be sorted. The framing and all that stuff needs to be put up on the ground. There's a bunch of things that people can do on a volunteer basis. Those who want to go on the roof can sign a waiver. It could be probably not children, but certainly parents and teachers and volunteers. And it's the same thing. You're picking up panels, you're carrying them over, you're laying them on top of a grid. They get bolted in, and when the whole thing is done, an electrician comes and plugs all the panels together and then plugs it into an electrical system. Significantly reduce the cost of this project.
And I think you have your first volunteer.
Sure, I'll volunteer.
And a couple of others sitting up here.
So it's worth looking into when you talk to installers whether or not that would be an option and you know how much they're willing to work with you to get that done.
Thank you.
Outstanding project.
They're outstanding kids.
One of the best presentations I've seen on solar ever. You guys are outstanding.
Yeah.
Job. You
Great
hit all the
job.
right things. It's great. I have a question of you guys. Now that you have this knowledge, has it changed what you do every day in your life? How you live your lives, whether you turn out lights in your house when you walk around? Are you more sensitive to the relationship between energy and carbon and our climate? And if so, what changes have you made in your life as a result of this project already? If any.
You can go up to the mic and answer.
Okay. It definitely has changed a lot. Like, I'm starting, to actually know the statistics of stuff. although I already have solar panels on my house, which
Good for
is
you.
the first
Good for you.
slide, the image, that's me taking a picture of my house. So,
Outstanding.
yeah, but I've definitely, stopped leaving lights on and, thought more about whether I should drive to school or bike to school. I've been biking to school.
For you.
Yeah, and, it starts to nag into my mind, like, is this a waste of energy? Should I be actually doing this? So I think it's actually working, I guess.
Excellent.
Thank you.
You can really drive? You drive to school? This is amazing.
Other questions or comments from the commission?
I had a question. Have you looked at other schools? And have other schools done a project like yours? And if so, is there something maybe you could learn from what they did, how they raised money, what kind of experts they involved, any lessons that you learned from other schools?
You want to talk about, you said you were something.
Well, we were participating in like the My Solar School contest, and our mentor, who was Mr. Conkle, said that he was mentoring some other schools in our district, but we weren't able to learn anything from them because they were just starting. But we know that Pioneer is actually learning from us instead of the other way around.
That's even better.
That's even better.
Oh, I should know, you probably know this, but there's a small array up on the Steiner High School that's not too far from you. Yeah, it was put up by the Solar Works program that Emil had a few years ago. So yeah, it's a small array. It's like 2 kilowatts or something like that. But you could talk to them. They've probably been capturing data. It's a ballasted system up on the roof like yours would probably be.
Yeah. We've been in contact with the Saline Library, which they had a recent array, and they said it's been really good to track the data. And so we've been working on creating curriculum for our whole school so that all the grades would be involved. Yeah, and we read an article that Charlie brought in about many schools in Utah and California that have moved to solar.
Great.
Very good.
Any other questions or comments?
Great job. Thank you for inspiring
Yes,
us.
thank you so much for coming. It was a delight to hear your project, and good luck raising the money. We'll have to have you back when it's done.
I can tell you about our data.
And we encourage you to stay if you want, because there's some other maybe interesting presentations that you might learn from too.
Okay, moving right along. That was wonderful. It's so good to have
Makes me feel good. Something to feel good about.
young folks getting involved in solar. The East China Township Natural Gas Plant presentation by Charles Griffith from the Ecology Center.
Yeah, this was great, and it actually inspires me to provide this next presentation because it will cover some of the same subjects. Can you pull up my presentation? You want me to? Okay, let's see. There we go. Yes.
The kids are going to be much better at this. Ask a 6th grader for help.
That one.
There you
Thank
go.
you very much.
Oh, darn.
You almost had it?
Good job.
Thank you for the tech support. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me tonight. I was asked if I could, as one of the interested parties, if I could come and present on the proposal that's currently in front of the Michigan Public Service Commission from DTE to a proposal to build a new 1,000 megawatt natural gas power plant And I will try to present some of the highlights from that proposal. It's a 1,000+ page proposal in its entirety, and so I'll pull out some highlights, and then I'll turn to some of the key criticisms that some of the intervenors in the case are making, including those that are representing the Ecology Center. So that will probably make it clear that I'm not exactly a neutral party in this case, so I don't want to pretend to be, though I will try to be objective, of course. And I also, toward that end, I want to give credit to the Sam Gomberg from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who helped with preparation of some of the slides for tonight's presentation. They're one of our Union of Concerned Scientists is one of our partners in this case. And so there's also a whole team of other experts that have been helping with the technical and legal analysis in this case as well. So let me start by kind of framing this up. What this chart shows is that the current proposal is being driven by something that's actually good. It's DTE's plan to shift away from coal. It's scheduled to retire several of its coal plants in about 2023, and then another plant later in the decade, around 2030. And so the proposal that's currently in front of the commission deals with that first dip in the capacity of DTE to provide the sort of needed power to supply its customers. So that's the proposal. What the proposal they've made, though, contains is part of the proposal is their integrated resource plan that projects out over the next decade and a half what kind of needed resources there are. And so there's a little bit of combination of both their short-term proposal and the long-term planning that will be sort of covered tonight. So the basics of their proposal is about $1 billion natural gas power plant, providing about 1,100 megawatts of power. Incidentally, other parts of the proposal do include some incremental increases in energy efficiency, demand response, some new solar and new wind. And they also note additional pump storage capacity, which they're part owners of the Ludington pump storage facility. Their integrated resource plan includes a second natural gas plant, about another 1,000 megawatts or so later in the decade. But the current proposal on the table is for this first power plant to be built by 2023. So, this proposal, these charts show essentially what the mix in DTE's generation looks like between its current fleet and the projected fleet in 2025 if this gas plant was built. And as you can see, they're really primarily, the primary shift is shifting from those coal plants that are going to be retired to natural gas. There is, as I mentioned earlier, some increase in renewables. It's fairly incremental, I would argue, and that is also about what they are required to do under the current renewable portfolio standard. So between that and the energy efficiency requirements in the state's energy waste reduction standard, that is pretty much what they've proposed to do so far. Now, in order to get approval from the commission, they will need to will need to prove that this proposal is the most reasonable and prudent alternative for its customers. And as I mentioned, the Ecology Centers is partnered with a number of other organizations which have asked various experts to both conduct a review of DTE's proposal, as well as prepare sort of an alternative scenario that we think could be a better plan. Some of the interveners, other than the Ecology Center and UCS I mentioned, the Environmental Law and Policy Center, Vote Solar, MEC, which I note that Charlotte Jameson is a member of, is a staff member of, NRDC, and the Sierra Club. And there's some others out there as well. I would also note that the Public Service Commission staff have also testified in this case and have raised a number of concerns with DTE's analysis as well. And then kind of on the other side of the equation, there are a number of manufacturing industries. Their association called ABATE has also filed objections to the case, but they make a slightly different set of arguments about what they think should happen than we do. Namely, that they argue that keep the coal plants open longer. So I mentioned that the team of experts that we're working with have prepared sort of an alternative clean energy scenario. And they evaluated, when they evaluated DTE's proposal and the capacity needs, the shortfall that we talked about earlier, they ran their own model that found that we could meet those capacity needs with a combination of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and demand response for a lower cost and providing a more diverse and cleaner resource mix. The energy efficiency, and part of what is included in that scenario is increasing the energy efficiency up to 2% of energy savings annually, which is a very reasonable and small increase in the amount of energy efficiency that the DTE included. A fairly significant increase, however, in solar and wind resources. And our model found that the cost savings would add up to over $340 million compared to the proposed gas plant. Now, we also had some of the, had this model, or the assumptions in this model run through DTE's own model as well to verify these findings, and projected out over the longer time frame, found that actually these savings could result in as high as $1 billion in savings through 2040. And in part, that is accomplished through delaying the building of the second natural gas plant that is in DTE's longer term plans. I mentioned that there are other, I should mention that there are also other scenarios that were modeled by some of our friends that are also interveners in the case. MEC, NRDC, Sierra Club had consultants run some additional models where they increased the amount of demand response and energy efficiency to higher levels that they believe that are very reasonable and cost effective. And they found actually even higher savings in some of those scenarios. And Charlotte might be persuaded to talk about that at some point.
Yeah, I've got a handout that kind of runs through that, so I can, maybe at the tail end of your presentation, talk about some of those scenarios, if that
Great.
works.
That sounds great. Now, so, you know, how are we coming up with such different findings? Well, part of the review, as I mentioned, was looking at DTE's own proposal and trying to to find what led them to those conclusions and whether those were valid assumptions that they were making or not. And I won't run through all these right now due to time, but we found a number of flaws that we believe are significant in DTE zone analysis, which we think created an inappropriate bias in favor of the proposed gas plants and against some of the other clean energy resource options that we modeled. Just a couple of the highlights is, one big area that we had a disagreement is over projected natural gas prices. We found that DTE's forecasts were overly optimistic. If those costs are low, it obviously makes the natural gas plant look a lot better. On the flip side of that, we found overly pessimistic assumptions about the availability and cost and performance of renewable energy resources, as well as energy efficiency and other things like battery storage. And so, without going into a lot of the nitty-gritty details about why that was the case, those were big problems that we found and are issues that we're taking up in the case. Our team also did a jobs and economic analysis of our alternative clean energy resource plan, and found that there would be superior economic benefits from the alternative scenario as well, including a whole bunch of jobs in the construction and maintenance of additional wind and solar resources. Actually, about 10 times the number of construction jobs, and about 4 times the number of sort of permanent jobs to maintain those facilities over time. There would, of course, be additional increased local and state taxes that would be associated with those activities. And I might add that the consumer savings, the $340 million plus that I mentioned, that would be the result of this alternative scenario, would have additional indirect benefits to the economy as well. Well, I know Ann Arbor cares about climate change, and we feel that that is one of the key reasons why we should be concerned about this proposal. DTE cares about climate change too, at least according to their own plans and their pronouncements. They've committed to achieving 80% reduction of CO2 by 2050, and just I've included a few bullets of what their components of that plan are. There's a whole lot of renewable energy in that plan. There is still a significant amount of natural gas in that plan, and there's the closure of those coal facilities, which we commend. Our problem with this particular proposal on the table is that it seems to be front-loading that gas generation, those gas generation facilities, when they're not yet necessary. And it, for the most part, it results in postponing much of the renewable investments that seem to be promised until post-2030. I might add that even from DTE's own proposal, there's what I believe it is to be an admission that their own 80% goal becomes more difficult under this scenario. One of the scenarios they modeled was for a 75% reduction in CO2 by 2040. Yes, 2040. But they didn't choose that scenario. They chose the scenario that is the basis for their proposal today. So they say that they can still meet that goal, but they don't explain how or why, and why this would be the best way. other than that their model found that this was the least cost according to their assumptions. We would argue that we need to be making CO2 reductions as soon as we can, and the last thing that we should do is lock in additional investments in fossil-based resources that will, in all likelihood, need to be curtailed in future years as we, try to get down to that 80 to 90% reduction. So those, resources quite likely become stranded assets that we, as utility customers, will be on the hook for. I would also just throw in that while it's certainly not impossible, that this plan and this strategy might make it more difficult for Ann Arbor to meet its climate reduction goals and its renewable energy commitment as well. Okay. Seems to be stuck here. As far as the timeline, a lot of this information I'm sharing tonight is based on a lot of testimony that the various experts in the case have filed. There are hearings this week taking place in front of the commission that will allow parties to cross-examine each other, et cetera. There's going to be briefs. The final briefs in the case are due next month in March, and by law and by schedule, the commission must make a decision by April 27th. So we're under a pretty short timeline where the decision will be made about this proposal, and I've included the case number in case people want to get more information, dig into the details, or perhaps make a comment to the commission. My key takeaways that I'll leave with you are that, after a thorough review of DTE's analysis and a rationale for its proposed gas plant, that including evaluation by multiple consultants and experts in the field, we do not think that they've sufficiently proven the need for this gas plant, or that it's the best path forward for meeting its customers' needs. And secondly, based on our own analysis, and again verified using DTE's own modeling tools, we think that we've shown that a combination of wind and solar resources combined with increased investments in energy efficiency and demand response can better meet DTE's identified capacity needs at lower costs, creating a more diverse and lower risk portfolio of resources and driving greater economic benefits to the state. So thank you, and I've also put up the link for a website that is trying to keep the general public aware of what's going on with this case. So thanks.
Thank you. That was very informative. Questions or comments from the commission?
Would you like me to touch on the demand response and
sure. I'm sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
I have some handouts. I'll be super brief because I'm sure there are definitely questions for Charles. But these are some handouts that kind of run through the different scenarios that Michigan Environmental Council and Natural Resource Defense Council had commissioned. And I think the three things that I would hit on from the energy efficiency and the demand response side of things is that there were some errors in DTE's integrated resource plan and modeling around this that we corrected for, and which increase kind of the net present value of savings that you would see. And so the first of those is that, as Charles mentioned, they were modeling ostensibly for a 1.5% annual energy efficiency saving. but they were arguing that 1.15% of that was embedded already in their modeling. And so really what they were doing was only adding 0.35% annually. And so we corrected for that and corrected it back to the 1.5% because we didn't believe that that 1.15% was actually embedded. The other piece of that too is that while they were only accounting for 0.35% annual efficiency, they were accounting for the full cost of a 1.15% program that you would run. So you saw less savings, but the full cost of a 1.15. So we corrected that, and that's sort of in that first bucket of this row here. The other piece too to flag is that we sort of looked at, can we do 2% energy efficiency and what would that look like? And the arguments presented by DTE was that you get to 2024 and there's no more cost. You can't do cost-effective energy efficiency at 2%. We have to go back to 1.5%. And that's just not what we've seen in other states that have moved in that direction, that you continue to see low-hanging fruit, you continue to see cost-effective energy efficiency at 2% annual. And so we grossed that up and looked at what it would look like if you did 2% through 2030. The other piece around demand response in particular is that the way the models work is if there isn't capacity, the models won't look for demand, or they won't look for demand response. So they won't add that in if there isn't a need for capacity. And so until the coal plants shut down, the models are essentially saying no demand response, or just sort of what we're doing already. So we also corrected for that. And then the other piece too is that there's a lot of fairly inexpensive demand response that Michigan isn't really doing as much right now around time of use pricing and these sorts of things that send price signals to users that are very effective and come at a lower cost to implement than your typical demand response around air conditioner shutoffs or these sorts of things. The current proposal that is included in DTE's proposal around demand response only sort of looked at those more expensive programs. And so we, kind of looked at what if we added in some of these lower cost demand response options that are fairly effective. So that's all sort of integrated into there. And then you can see the total all-in cost in net present value of DTE's proposal is about is $15.5 billion. And so the savings, these net present savings, are relative to that $15.5 billion. So that's what that column is. And then we ran a few scenarios around increased transmission, and if you could gross up the kind of transmission capacity that you're getting, what would that look like as well? So, and again, I would just underscore what Charles said, that our kind of takeaway also was that there were flaws in the integrated resource plan that should be corrected for. And that in the end, the proposal that was selected is not the least cost and is not the least risky. And so therefore, the Public Service Commission should, send DTE back kind of to the drawing board to come back with another proposal. And that proposal might very well include natural gas, perhaps at a smaller scale or perhaps farther out, but that there are resources that we could be capitalizing on much sooner and that we should be doing that as opposed to what's outlined here. So,
thank you. Comments or questions from other commissioners?
I have a question. In both of these, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, and thank you for that clarification. It's really helpful. In both of the plans, whether it's your model adopted or DTE's model is adopted, in both of them, we still end up with about half of the power generated with coal. When we're all said and done. And it seems like, I guess the question is some consideration of Fermi 3 even being discussed by either side in terms of the long-term scenario here, because we're still going to have a lot of coal, and it's still going to be making the same impact 50 years from now, it's making now every day. We turn on a coal plant and
Right.
we get climate change. So you can reduce the problem. We can go to hell slower, but ultimately we need to eliminate coal. And I don't see either of these plans having any vision on that, or way to do that. And it seems like it's not possible to do that without Fermi 3.
Well, that's a much longer conversation, I think, but I will say that from from what I've read of DTE's carbon reduction plan, that they do intend to close their last coal plant around 2040, which is the one in Monroe. All right, so now that raises the question, okay, what resources are going to replace that? You know, our belief is that we've got still a long ways we can go with these clean energy resources. And this is, you know, we only modeled this next period of time, really. What we can do beyond that, and, you know, one of the things I maybe didn't stress enough is that, you know, this plan, unfortunately, has only a sort of modest increase in renewables, whereas we know that this industry is going crazy right now. I mean, it's gangbusters, and so why would we not want to take full advantage of a resource that now is cheaper than, you know, it's not just our analysis, but there's many out there. It's cheaper than any new fossil resources, and is expected to be cheaper than even existing plants where we've already amortized the cost of those plants, like, you know, like the Monroe plant and some of the other coal plants out there. It's going to be cheaper. So why not do as much of that as possible? You know, there's a myth about whether we need big base load plants anymore. We can, if we optimize the grid and balance it out, and we have maybe some peaker plants that can help when there's like an extended 5 days of no sun or wind, though we can still handle some of that with battery storage and other kinds of storage technologies, then maybe we don't need any sort of big plant like a Fermi plant. But, you know, one of the questions that will come up that we'll have to address in the next 20 years is what's going to happen with the existing Fermi plants, which are only scheduled to be in operation until 2045, and that's after a 20-year extension. So that is still a big question mark. And at this point, you know, nuclear is just not very economic. And, you know, that's not even to bring up some of the other concerns that people will validly bring up.
I had one quick comment.
Sure.
Especially for the students, just so they have a sense of what we're talking about here. I did some quick math, and if my math is right, the power plant that we're talking about is 33,000 times bigger in terms of output than the solar installation on your school. So this is really a huge decision. And I think the process that we have here is really important for you to understand, is that there's at least two parties that are presenting their ideas on what is the best solution for the people who consume power in the state of Michigan. And so the utility DTE is putting together its arguments in defending those proposals and those calculations, and this other group is doing the same thing, and in front of this commission, they're hopefully coming to the best decision on this really massive installation that, like I said, is 33,000 times bigger than yours. And not only that, that's only looking at peak capacity. And a natural gas plant operates essentially all the time, whereas solar only operates when the sun is shining. So actually, the size of this installation is maybe 50 or 70,000 times bigger than the solar project on your roof. So that's why this is so important.
Just means it'll take a lot of schools, and that's no problem, right?
Right, I mean, it takes a lot of schools.
maybe I can jump in with a couple comments for those who don't know me. I work for DTE, so also providing another perspective here. And I'm by no means an expert on this, Con, so what I'd like to offer is if we do want to, as a commission here, kind of DTE's perspective on some of the very specific points brought up here, I'm happy to get a colleague of mine to come in next month and just share that so we can hear both sides of it. What I can say, just a couple things in reaction here. One of the challenges, and you kind of brought this up, is around the intermittency of renewables. So yes, kind of on a production basis, they are getting very close to, or in some cases, lower cost than a fossil fuel plant. But they're still intermittent, meaning they work when the sun is shining or when the wind is blowing. And right now, I would say that storage is not economic. Not sure where it'll be in 10 years. Maybe it'll see a curve like solar and wind have seen, and it will be. But that's really not where things are right now. So we'd have to be kind of banking on something that's definitely not a sure thing, and if it doesn't come down like that, is extremely expensive right now. And the second piece for that I think is really important is when we start talking about the level of storage that we would need in order to manage this. I actually, in my prior role at DT, did some detailed modeling around the amount of storage infrastructure that you'd need. It's a heck of a lot of stuff you gotta build. So this is, it's not like a plant, but it's gonna be as big as a plant. You're gonna need somewhere to put this storage. It's not, and it's a big chemical infrastructure that's made from chemicals that are mined, and we don't quite know what we're gonna do with them after their life cycle and everything. So there's challenges associated with that too, not to say they won't be overcome. We've seen lots of progress in the space, but it's kind of worth mentioning. So right now, if we were to ramp up solar and wind significantly, and they help balance each other out because they often blow kind of in opposite directions or produce in opposite directions, but it's not perfect. Right now, what a gas plant helps provide is this ability to kind of ramp up and down with the needs of when we see customers using energy. And there are small peaker plants that can ramp up and down extremely quickly and provide that little burst, as you said, but they are not very efficient. They're very, very expensive for that energy they produce, and you wouldn't want to use them very much. So that's, I think, one of the utilities' perspective on why the gas plant is a valuable part of a portfolio. The second thing that I would just say is, you talked about kind of front loading in the time scheme of do you do renewables up front, do you do the gas up front and the renewables later? So we know that renewable costs are continuing to come down, and there's obviously a time value to both to money and when you spend that money, but there's also a time value to avoiding carbon emissions because it is cumulative. And the way I think about this personally is simply that, thinking about the timing of CO2 reductions, were you to do more earlier at a higher cost, because we know it's going to be higher cost to do it now than it will be to do it 10 years down the road. To do more earlier, it's a policy decision about the value of reducing carbon emissions. And that's a policy decision that kind of lies outside of the framework of how these decisions are made, which asks for the lowest cost option. And so it's, there's perhaps a conflict there, and I just want to say that, I think that there's an opportunity to engage in a policy discussion about, is that the right framework, or should we, as a society, talk about accepting higher costs and the things that come with that, including, the impacts on our lower income customers and so forth. Should we accept that because of the benefit of reducing carbon emissions earlier? So that's it's entirely kind of different discussion, but one that I know sometimes here we have tried to have as a commission.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Holcomb.
I could speak on this topic for a little while, as you probably all know. The only thing I want to add and make sure the students are aware of this, and it's really important and it adds maybe to the discussion a little bit more, and that is we have these things called wires. And you guys have all seen the wires that come into your house and how important those are. And even if you have a solar system on your roof, that's great, and it's a way that you can generate electricity yourself and serve your own load. The challenge becomes, as Shoshana mentioned, when the lights and the sunlight goes out. And if we store energy locally, we can dispatch it locally, and you can use a battery to your own service, your own health facility. You can actually, if you choose to, go off the grid, and it's a very expensive proposition right now. And there are ways you can manage all this, but fundamentally, until we change the way we distribute electricity, it's really hard to scale up all these renewables and make it an efficient proposition. And we can talk about this from a cost point of view. We can even value those carbon emissions and start bringing that into the equation. That's not part of our current state law. It's done elsewhere. But the real argument here is, are we going to change the way we distribute electricity? And until we really change stepwise, going from a distributed, centralized power generation to home kind of configuration to a more distributed generation process, which is where maybe these electrons are generated local to the need. Until we change that dramatically, which is probably not in my lifetime because I'm an old guy, but eventually maybe in your lifetime something like this is going to become a more prolific use. Think about that. Think about wires and how the electrons actually flow, because it's not like your cell phone where you don't need wires. You need wires for electricity. And until we have a solution for that, really it makes it a more difficult proposition to change the way we've done things to date. So anyway, it's an interesting dynamic there.
Commissioner Jameson.
I have a question for Charles, too. I think it might help for some perspective, too, in terms of the renewable piece that, you know, since 2008, when we first adopted our renewable energy standard of 10%, we've been adding about, 1.5% a year. And so the modeling you guys did, that was looking at, okay, if we hit the 15% in 2021 and then continue that sort of, is it a similar rate of annual addition of renewables that we'd be seeing?
Yeah, it's a very similar rate.
So it's saying,
so it's
you know,
not, it's
keep
not
the pace.
super aggressive.
Yeah.
And I might add that it's still in 2025 would amount to about 25% of the generation mix. So still 75% of the generation mix would be coming from coal, some gas peaker plants, and then also the existing nuclear facilities and DTE's fleets. So, it's not like we're all of a sudden relying mostly even on renewable resources under our plan. And the other thing that I guess, Shoshana, you've raised some good points, but the characterization that I have to object to is that they cost more, because actually what I'm here to say is that the gas plant, according to our analysis and our review of the data, is the more expensive option. And so a question would be, do we want to keep, spending more money for a fossil resource because your company's not quite ready to go to a more of a distributed generation mix? And while it's true that renewables are intermittent, the way that our analysis incorporates them into the model and the way that it's just done today is that you have capacity factors for each resource. And so a solar farm is only given a capacity factor of maybe 50% because the sun is only shining half the time, or a wind resource is only given a capacity factor of X percent. And so you have to build more of that capacity than you would if it was running all the time. And yes, storage can play a role, but our model didn't rely on storage. So I would just sort of return at least the argument. I mean, I know these are valid questions to bring up, but until you really dig into the analysis and look at the actual models and the analysis that's done here, I think it's hard to argue that our plan is more expensive, or that somehow it won't be reliable. for the grid, because our findings are that it is.
Other comments or questions?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Is the wind and solar in your model located in the East China Township area?
It would be located throughout the service area. No, it wouldn't be all located there. That would be a lot of renewable resources to be built there. But that does raise one other point. I don't want to belabor this, but that one of our findings that I didn't spend a lot of time on is about risk of a particular resource. And one is like building a big plant like that. It does expose you to more risk in the sense that now that you built it, you've got to keep, supplying it with natural gas. What if natural gas prices go up higher than what was projected? And we, as I mentioned, think that they were overly optimistic based on just data that's out there today. But if the prices did spike up more, we would be stuck with that cost. Also, if there's any kind of plant failure, that's 1,000 megawatts of power that goes down, whereas not all of your solar and wind is going to likely go down all at once. So there's an argument to be made about having a more diverse mix of resources on the grid actually being less risky.
I have a brief comment. I don't know to what degree this is relevant for this particular project, but for everyone in the room, including the students again, there's an interesting project in South Australia, the state of South Australia. It's a joint project between Tesla and the government and the utility there. And the idea that is to be implemented, at least it's advertised this way, is by the year 2022, so it's actually just in the next 4 years, is to put solar on 50,000 homes together with Tesla batteries or power, what they call power walls. And that will be the equivalent of a 250 megawatt power plant. So about 1/4 the size of the one that's being described here. But what's interesting is that this shows that there are, at least on the drawing board, and actually even more than on the drawing board, there are projects to do large-scale power plant equivalent projects that use distributed solar, in this case no wind, but solar with batteries to provide a lot of power, actually 20% of the power for the entire state of South Australia. And the interesting twist that they're doing is they are starting with public housing, especially low-income housing, so the benefit flows to people who really need to have their utility costs reduced, because utility costs are high for people who don't have a lot of income. And so it's a really interesting project, and it might be at some point instructive to look at something like that here, even in Michigan. Whether that's something that's could do this, replace this stage or a part of this stage, or something that's maybe more mature by the 2027 second phase of natural gas expansion, something like that certainly would be interesting. And I encourage you, if you do a web search using Google or whatever, you can easily see there's a YouTube video and there's some articles that you can look at. And that could be also homes with schools and things like that. It's not obviously just on tops of homes. So the technology is changing quickly.
Other questions or comments from the commission? Well, I'd like to just wrap it up with a few things. I think that it's really important to talk about the area under the curve. How fast we move away from combusting fossil fuels determines how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And to front load it with natural gas as opposed to front loading it with renewables, where there is basically virtually no risk as far as the cost of natural gas in the future. If you go with renewables, you know what the cost is going to be in the future, because the solar is free. To predict the cost of natural gas over a 40 or 50-year life, I think, is almost ridiculous. If you look historically at what the price of natural gas has been, it's been all over the place. It was for a time much higher, like 3 or 4 times higher what it is now. And it may come back at some point in time, and I don't think anybody can really predict for sure. And if you build the plant, you're stuck with paying whatever it costs. So I think for those 2 reasons, we really should look at this. And thank you very much for the presentation.
I'd just like to add one thing, that the model also doesn't take into consideration the amount of leakage that's happening at the natural gas wellheads, which aren't factored into this at all. So if we look at the larger picture, using natural gas in any way, it makes no sense to front-end load it. So.
There was another interesting piece that I saw in the news in the last week or 2 that there's a perpequeue of solar in this state that of people who want to install large solar arrays that's over 400 megawatts. Now, that won't necessarily, they might not all come to fruition, but that's just now. That's not 10 years from now or 15 years from now, and that's pretty significant. It's not a quarter of the plant because solar really only has probably a capacity factor of about 25%.
Yeah.
It's less than wind,
17.
which is up in the
I was
40s.
gonna say more like 15 in
17.
Michigan.
Or 15?
17,
17.
if you single
If it's got tracking, yeah.
Tracking bumps it up.
I would
So-
say, just add to that too, I think, and you hit on this in some of the jobs numbers that you were talking about, but I think there's an economic development component of this.
Sure.
Not only jobs addition, but you see GM and other companies demanding renewables and moving to 100% renewables. And so I think Michigan does a lot of work around tax incentives and these other things to try to attract businesses. And this is going to be an increasingly large component of that is, can we actually supply the renewables that they're looking to have? So I think that's a big piece of this too.
There was, to finish this off, it's not exactly related, but I had forgot to put on the agenda that I had asked Commissioner Jameson to give us a little bit of insight into what the new announcement that there's a move on to put 30% renewables by 2030 on the fall ballot, which I think would be an interesting thing to have happen. So if you could...
Before we do that, I would just endorse the idea of having DTE come
Sure.
here.
Yes. Yeah, I
And
think that'd be
Charles,
fine.
I would welcome having you and others in the audience and having, if it's possible in this kind of format, a little bit of a debate on the merits of both sides. I think it would be really interesting, and it would basically give everybody a practice round before you go in front of the MPSC.
It's a pretty weedy subject. I
Yes.
mean, you know, when you look at the 620 pages that these
Yes.
folks put together and the 1,000-plus pages of the initial proposal, it's a lot of reading to do. And it's sort of good bedtime reading.
We'll get the executive summaries, maybe.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay,
Charles.
thank you.
Yeah, so it was recently announced, and the ballot language was just approved today by the Board of Canvassers. Sorry, it's today. Yes, today's Tuesday. I'm getting confused. This is the day of the week. This morning, and essentially the language would do a stepwise renewable energy mandate, and so builds off of the 15% by 2021, would take us 18% by 2022. 21% by 2024, 24% by 2026, 27% by 2028, and finally 30% by 2030. So I think, again, going back to that point earlier that Charles had made is the question of when we hit the 15% in 2021, where do we go from there? And there's a lot of debate about how do we continue to do that transition to renewable energy that we've been doing since 2008. There is also a cost cap in there. I think we look at some of the costs of renewables, and there's debate as to whether or not, even moving in that direction would require additional costs. And we've seen that the surcharges on renewables have gone away. But just in case, they included a cost cap of no more than an average of $2 per month for an electric provider's residential customers. So it's a little bit the way it's worded, but that'll appear on the ballot language so people have kind of an idea in their heads of what this could potentially, it's doubtful that it would cost that much, but if it did, that would be kind of the cost cap. I should also say that Michigan Environmental Council has not officially endorsed the ballot initiative. That's something that our board has to approve or disapprove. But that we have been obviously supportive of renewable energy and do see the 30% by 2030 projection as a smooth continuation of the progress we've been making so far. So this doesn't seem to be a really aggressive or kind of out of the norm proposal. And the proposal is primarily being supported by NextGen, which is Tom Steyer's organization. As I think many folks know, Tom Steyer, he's a California billionaire who is a big clean energy proponent, and is kind of looking at ways to sort of further renewable energy across the state or across the U.S. and thought that this was a good opportunity here in Michigan. So it's a little bit about that.
Can I ask, is it a proposal like the last one? It's a constitutional amendment?
It's not a constitutional amendment. It's a legislative, so it'll go to the legislature if and when they get enough petition signatures. So it's not.
I know last time there was a lot of consternation, even from people who supported the goal, about the idea of kind of having energy policy in your constitution.
Yeah, so they've learned that lesson from the past and have corrected it this time around with some gentle pushing from various groups as well. Yeah.
Some not so gentle.
Yeah.
Well, and it's an interesting proposal. I mean, for those of us who remember the 25 by 2025 and the fact that it didn't pass, it's like, it's a really good idea, but we don't want to lose again for sure. And last time, I think the pro folks for that spent $14 million, and the anti folks, which were consumers in DTE and abate, spent like 50 or something.
25.
25 million on it. So we were outspent, and it'll be interesting if someone happened to come from DTE next meeting, we could ask them whether or not they approved of this. It might be an interesting question. But we got to move in that direction, and it's always how fast and how much it's going to cost and everything. But it's an interesting development, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. Getting back on schedule here, we have committee updates. Environmental Commission update. Commissioner Mirsky.
So I'll keep this fairly brief because I don't think I need to go into a lot of details for you to understand what we have been doing. So metrics have been a key topic in both commissions. The last Environmental Commission, the majority of the meeting was dedicated to a review of Environmental Commission related metrics, similar to what we did here in the Energy Commission. So Josh and I reviewed the results of the metrics subcommittee of the two commissions, Energy and Environmental, on which also Sarah Palig served. And we went through all of the various recommendations that the subcommittee made. We gathered input from the subcommittee. Subsequent to that, we have met with Laura Rubin of the Huron River Watershed Council to get input on watershed-related metrics, and we have plans to meet with 5 or 6 other city staffers to get some more specific input on how to improve those. One of the things that I didn't mention before related to the forum that I talked about earlier last Thursday. on measuring and tracking sustainability is I presented an improvement action plan that's been reviewed by the city administrator, and that includes an agreement between Josh and me, and him and Nate and Matt were also in the room, where we plan on finalizing those metrics by the end of April or May, and then I think May, and then improving the trend charting of those by the end of July, and then developing 5-year work plans for each department to attain those goals, starting with the fiscal year 2020 budget. And that sounds like a long way from now, but actually the budget starts to be worked on this fall. So that really makes sense. It's a nice progression. And so the work that the Environmental Commission did was basically a continuation of what we did here in this committee in a couple of meetings. The only other thing that I'd like to mention is that the Environmental Commission got an update on solid waste in its December meeting, and in some correspondence with the administrator about some potential issues that came up at that time, including projections on the development of the Solid Waste Reserve Fund, which is actually in the minutes. We anticipate, don't have a 100% commitment, but we anticipate a new update in the meeting at the end of this month, in the February Environmental Commission meeting. So those are the two major topics that we covered.
Great, thank you. Climate Action Plan priorities, Commissioner Hookham.
So a major buildup to our next subcommittee meeting, which will be the inaugural meeting for the subcommittee, and because I don't know all the members of the committee and who wants to serve, I'm going to use this little speech to entice others to join in the effort. But effectively, this big climate action plan that a few of us in this room served on and wrote is seriously out of date. It was written in probably 2009-ish with goals to be complete by 2012. And obviously, there's quite a few actions that came out of this. Just for those that like statistics, that are engineering-minded, roughly 80% of the climate goals were reduction of carbon greenhouse gases associated with energy and buildings. So a large percentage of it falls under our little bailiwick, right? And there's 25 different actions that the group came up with, and there were estimated reductions in greenhouse gases associated with each of those 25 actions, some of which we've talked about today, like increase the renewable portfolio standard represents a significant part of our predicted annual carbon emission. Obviously, we know where that goes, and there's been stepwise increase, obviously, that we're looking at right now. But what would happen if we changed that? So we're seriously out of date. We still show a fairly large amount of potential in the energy and building space. My own professional practice says that the building space is particularly attractive, as we know, and that the renewable side of what we can do in Ann Arbor within the bounds of Ann Arbor physically is pretty limited, but potentially some opportunities to leverage make sense. So as that enticement, I think we're ready to roll up our shirt sleeves, cross off those that don't make sense, add anything else that makes sense, and update things from an energy and building point of view. I guess the question for Nate and City is, are we going to update the entire climate action plan, or is this going to be a stepwise revision that we'll tackle separately outside of that plan process? Because it's a formal plan now, and it's been voted on and approved by council. Where do we go with that next? Because it is.
Yeah, I wonder, I think last time it was discussed, might have been the last work session, we had the old energy plan that then got an update, more of a concise, and I know you relayed the point that why gin up another 200-page document when we can get to the essence in 10 pages or what have you. So I think this could serve as an update to it, and one that's like an update in that is based on new information, revised estimates, things like that. Why not?
Okay.
Yeah.
So we had roughly 15 people, Wayne, I think, that wrote this originally. Certainly one person's not going to do a good job of that 15 people can do. There's a lot of bright minds in this room that can get this done. So I'm asking for leadership to advise what the next step should be. My attitude, and also maybe frame up this a little bit in terms of timeline. How fast do we need to get this done? What's our urgency? I know Josh did a great job flashing what the city's being able to do from a greenhouse gas reduction point of view. A lot of these targets are more of the citizen and business community. So in my perspective, what's going to have the biggest impetus, similar to what we found in energy efficiency, is a lot of education and a lot of benefit that can be added through outreach. So this is not just statistics and getting numbers, it's actually implementing. So there's a lot of ways, a lot of directions this could go depending on the amount of emotion and passion put into it. So I'm one of those that is willing and able. I don't necessarily have time at the moment to lead it, but I'd be happy to interject or give ideas if that's the appropriate direction for our commission.
So if I could interject something.
Sure.
The two things down from here is the solar and energy efficient target setting is exactly that. After Josh's presentation and revising some of the goals, I asked, we talked about this I guess a while ago, but Josh was on an extended leave for a while, but he's now back, and he and I have now met and outlined the task of updating the climate action plan priorities and setting different solar targets and some energy efficient targets, including kind of looking at some near-term opportunities where for some large systems that could make a large, huge impact on meeting our solar goals. So I guess the question is, perhaps we could feed what we're doing into your process here. But I think, given the fact that we're dealing with some coming up new numbers for solar and energy efficiency, it could account for a large portion of what you're trying to do. So we can fold these two things together. We're doing this now, and we can do it under the guise of you, or just give you what we find and go from there.
I think for critical mass, we should combine the two efforts. That's
I
my
agree. Yeah.
So, but
All right,
because
Josh?
efficiency and solar are a big part of this. But,
we've already talked a bit about outlining the scope of answering this question and what it means. And so, so who do we talk to?
Well, we just do
Chuck, or I mean, if we roll this together, we're doing this. Are we the committee, or are you the committee, or how do you want to do this?
Well, it's a question of who else wants to be
who else wants
involved
to
with
be
it,
on
and
this thing?
I'll certainly volunteer to be part of it, and I think this is going to be helpful. You know, we've got $900,000 coming down the pike eventually here, and so this is good groundwork for that. So, and I think that's where we should be.
So we'll
spending
collapse
our
these
time.
things together?
Yeah.
$900,000 per year.
Per year.
For 8 years.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
There's also the university and what they're doing. There's also land use and how that impacted, climate. So I don't want to just take on energy. I think if we're going to do this, we should do it at a broader level. And do we want to outreach beyond this commission? Or do we do that as step 2?
I personally am not sure that I would be qualified to address some of the non-energy issues.
Right.
But
So should we outreach, or should we do that after we get our piece done?
Well, we got the 80%.
Yeah, we should get our piece done.
Well, and you have, an interesting thing is, since the plan was adopted, we now have a transportation commission. We do have a planning commission, and as it was crafted, the land use and access components sort of fall within planning's purview when you talk about land use and mobility type sorts of things. So I think maybe setting the template here first, and then seeing if it could be replicated in some of those other bodies.
Sure.
And then resource management likewise fit a little better with the environmental commission. So could it be a subcommittee for them?
So maybe a key question, who owns the climate action plan as it exists?
We own it. You're looking at it.
Came out of here, yeah.
Well, there was others, but I just suggested, we want to make sure we're stepwise with what commission wants, or not commission, but council wants to do, right?
Well, ultimately, the purpose is, this whole thing is to reduce carbon. So if there's ways to do that, then it takes pressure off something. Like one thing Josh and I talked about is the 80-20% split. does that still make sense? And there's been progress in a number of areas, so revisiting whether that split makes sense, and whether or not it should be separate split per sector. So industrial sector's got its own energy efficiency and renewables, think commercial, and what that means. Almost to the point where some sectors may offset others.
Sounds like time for a workshop to me.
Yeah. Yes.
A Saturday morning coffee class or something.
Sounds good.
We could do that.
Sounds good. Okay. Well, actually, the ball's in Josh's court now. He was going to come up with some stuff, so I'm waiting from. But we have some new marching orders, right? So Wayne, myself, Josh, and Chuck, right?
Yep, ready shooting.
So far?
Yep. Ready
Anybody
shooting.
else?
There had been the CAP group did include some others.
That's right. Mike Schreiber.
Yeah.
I'm sure
Schreiber, I believe.
Yeah.
Charlotte, I think you were on that as well, if you want to continue.
So, just so I'm understanding the scope, so the idea is review the old climate action plan, update it where needed.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the funding, I mean, that's already been sort of pegged for particular programs, right? Or at least in the first year? Or is a component of this updating the plan and then saying, okay, here's where some of the we think the funding should go?
Right.
Okay.
It'll help define.
For example, right now the plan calls for, under the 20% solar, calls for 24 megawatts of new solar. Well, perhaps the most likely, the carbon reductions that are being driven by DTE's work now reduces the overall carbon emissions target. So it's no longer, 20% may still be solar, but it may not be 24 megawatts, maybe
Gotcha.
15.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
So that makes a big difference when we say to Jack and other things, this is what we think the city ought to be doing with that $900,000. It makes a real difference.
Also, in terms of spending priorities, the only thing that has been decided officially is where council has said they want to devote 40% of the income or the revenue from the millage to climate action. There's another group that has proposed some very, very high-level division of that, but that is not official. And some people on council might even argue that the 900,000 isn't fixed in concrete. So to your basic question, is there something already that says there's clearly priority 1, 2, 3, and 1 is getting X dollars, 2 is getting Y, and 3 Z? No, correct?
Correct.
Correct.
And
So-
broad outlines around some of the areas.
Exactly, that's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of leeway.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm happy to help, definitely.
Great.
Okay, great.
So to be clear on the money, they're going to assess that tax for the first time in December of 2018. The city administrator has indicated that he doesn't want to start spending that money until fiscal year 20, I guess that is, which is July 1st of 19. But in the budget that we're currently working on, he's already ramping up our work on the climate action plan. He's reorganizing staff so that they report directly to him on these matters, and so that they can be prepared to start spending that money when we do finalize a budget on exactly how we're going to spend that. Some of that money could in fact go to increasing energy efficiency in our affordable housing, for instance. And so that's going to be, the nitty-gritty discussion in the budget process with the overlaying, priorities that have already been set. But certainly if you do this work, then as he develops his climate action staff within his office, he's got something to act on and plan ahead for.
Great. Thank you. Moving right along, solar schools.
Schools.
All right, so the students kicked it off really nicely tonight, and I'm just going to continue starting from the focus of the school and then broadening out. in my update. So as you heard tonight, what's happening is the Ann Arbor STEAM at Northside School is fully engaged in fundraising and doing the planning for getting solar power there. The district has approved that. And as one of the contestants in the My Solar Schools contest, they're working with Dave Conkle as their mentor throughout the process, and they're learning a lot. Dave is also mentoring Pioneer High School, which is the second school in the district, second of 2 schools in the district that are participating in this contest. The latest information that I have is that there are approximately 16 schools throughout the state that have signed up for this contest. What goes along with this contest, the award will be $1,000 for the school to put towards like a kickstarting campaign effort. Although STEAM has already started, so they're like almost $4,000 that they've raised so far. But so, and then part of the process is they're mentored in doing analysis for their power consumption and trying to figure out like what their exposure is and what size of array that they can have. And then the winners, in addition to the money, will also get continued technical support as well as promotional support to raise more funds. The district administration is on board with both schools moving forward. Dr. Swift, who's the superintendent of the Ann Arbor Public Schools, has stated that absolutely she's committed to this work and wants to launch the effort when we have the capacity to move the work forward appropriately. So they're putting pieces in place right now, doing the the research that's necessary for making this possible. And one of the elements is the hiring of the district's executive director for physical properties. And that person is Emil Lavazana. And a lot of you know who he is. You know, he's a LEED certified, architect. And so it's a really great asset in this endeavor for the district. And he also is, very much intending on moving the district forward with the planning and, strategic implementation of energy efficiency as well as renewable power generation. And he's particularly interested in seeing that the district, all students in the district from kindergarten through 12th grade get the educational value of having like solar power on the campuses, so that they can, as the kids were talking about doing the monitoring, data monitoring, and understanding, what it looks like outside in the weather looks like and how that's impacting the amount of electricity that's being produced and all kinds of other things that they can do with that. So that's pretty much what's actually happened so far as far as activity. There have been meetings between some key stakeholders in the Ann Arbor area. We met last week with Councilmember Eaton as well as the County Commissioner Conan Smith and Emil Lavazana. Nick Soberall from the U of M Energy Institute was there, Jeannie Wilson, Dave Conkle. So we had a very fruitful conversation around what could be possible working together. So, and that's pretty much it so far. Wonderful. And we're also the DTE. Shoshana has offered support in terms of getting our questions answered as far as the logistics of interconnection and things like that, and having modeling done.
Right.
Great.
So, that's it.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you for the report.
Just a brief question. Do you know if either of those 2 schools that are participating, whether there were some planned roof maintenance issues or anything they were going to spend money on anyway on the roof in the next 4 or 5 years?
I believe Pioneer does. I have to look at my list real quick. I can get back with you. Let's see here. Yes, Pioneer is one of the schools that's supposed to have some roof maintenance done. And one of the things that that for the quotes that we're going to be getting for, not we, but the district will be getting for the schools will include warranty, the roofs being warranted for having solar panels on them. Yeah.
That's important.
Right.
Yes, thanks.
And this, I'll just add this question of curricula and new environmental education efforts more broadly that the school might be undertaking specific to climate change is something that staff at least is trying to think about. How do we infuse that or more intentionally program that in coordination with the school? So this effort and other things around climate change should be part of that discussion, so.
Well, there definitely will be opportunities for funding because there's materials and instruments that need to be purchased for delivery of this curriculum. As Jeannie Wilson mentioned, that she's starting to develop the curriculum for K through 8 right now. That's going to be further developed. It takes, it takes something for it to meet the next gen science standards. And so, yeah, there's definitely going to be a request for support from the city.
Great.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that moving forward.
So, last time I stuck my toe in that water, which was a long time ago now, almost 10 years now, Dow Solar had developed a whole bunch of curriculum material. I don't know if that's still viable, if it's still around, but they spent Dow Foundation put some serious money into curriculum materials on solar for a while.
I'll have to look at it.
Yeah.
And there's this new, the other thing, I guess there was a Dixboro school, I think this was announced, that part of the programming that the K through 12 is going to do is utilize this school space that was recently, I think, a private, used for private, well, a private school space but had been dormant, but I think the school is going to be using this for environmental education, broadly speaking. It's out in Dixboro. I can find out a little bit more and send it around. There might have even been a write-up about it.
This is the former, the Run Like the Wind.
Run Like the Wind, yeah.
Okay, yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Is now, I think, going to be under the control of the public schools for environmental education.
That might be beginning next year. I'm
Yeah.
not quite certain. But yes, there's a call out for community participation in the planning for like farm to school programming. And yes, it seems like there might be an opportunity also for some solar out there too.
Yeah. So we'll see how that comes along.
Yeah.
Oh, good stuff.
Montessori, that was the word I was looking for.
Wonderful.
It's Montessori, that's what it is.
Thank you. Ordinances. Commissioner Paling.
That's me. We've used this month to do a lot of information gathering. So Nate's helped us put together a list of ordinances that are on the books that would relate to the Energy Commission. So we'll take a look at that. And then Mike Schreiberg has an intern who's been working on looking at possible ordinances. And so we've gathered that information. And then the third prong would be trying to pursue relationships to get us to network with some realtor and the real estate association in the area. It's been more difficult, or been relatively difficult, but we have some leads that we're pursuing. So our next steps are to meet in person. Now that we've done some good information gathering, we'll do that before the next Energy Commission meeting, and to try to arrange a meeting with some of these real estate contacts.
Great. Cool. Yeah, I actually told you last time I saw him, and he just sent him out. He's been out of the real estate for a while, yeah. We've kind of talked about solar and energy efficiency targeting setting. Have anything else you want to say about that? No? Okay. Public input. God, there's still people here. Are they still quiet? Anyone like to say anything? If not, I guess they want to get out of here. Public input is now closed. Items on for the next agenda.
It's a working session, just note. We did talk about getting someone from DTE. We could still do that, just for the sake of time, if that was something you'd want to help arrange over in here in the little room. Otherwise, that could go to the April session, though I know when it comes to the timing for the PSC process, that puts it a little further out there.
Could we shift our working session from the March meeting to the April meeting, if that's important? Just a question.
There's no reason we couldn't.
Yeah.
Let me follow up with my colleagues and see, who's available and so forth, just because I wouldn't want to shift things around and then not be able to make it anyways.
Okay, great.
But I'll get their perspective on that.
Would a presentation from Pioneer, similar to the one we had tonight, would that be appropriate?
I can ask.
I mean, I'd love to
It-
just
it might
keep
be-
up with both schools and see what's happening.
Depends on how far along they are.
Well, the
Yeah.
award will be given at the Michigan Earth Day Festival, and I believe that's the weekend of April 20th.
Ah, okay.
So when is our April meeting?
It's before the 20th.
Yeah.
But by,
So
only by a
it's
few
gotta be,
days.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's, if we end up having the regular meeting, in-
Sure.
either one, I guess. we would-
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, check it out. Yeah,
I'll ask.
that'd be good.
Or either date, or how about if we find out one way or another?
Yeah.
We might get Mark to donate or volunteer for a second project.
Really? It's getting expensive being on this committee.
It'll really be a working session.
Yeah. If there's nothing else for the agenda at this point, I will call this meeting adjourned at 12 minutes to 8.